Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Doomer Optimism podcast. We have two former guests here. We've got Rich and Gabe, who you know from their online Twitter personalities as VividVoid and RichDecibels. We are going to talk today about what I think it was Gabe said, the phrase, an integrated post-woke.
What the post woke integration might look like, or what the post woke, right? So, what direction culture can go in for, especially for those people in Blue Tribe or those people who are interested in social justice and still take that to heart, but have seen the fruits of the last 10 years and what that's panned out and.
Yes. And then and I'll kick it to Rich too for like some more I don't know, like framing comments, but at least for me right in this moment, like right now, I'm in such a weird place because I kind of like left America for almost a decade, and then I've been, kind of paying attention to what's been going on, and got really disillusioned by like far left stuff that I was encountering in academia in that period of time where I was away, and just like I don't resonate with this kind of like purity politics stuff. I just don't. I never have, and I won't ever. And so then I kind of like had this reaction to go maybe slightly further right than I even really am, because I was just mad at that whole culture being what it was. And turning into like a weird, scoldy, like not fun thing. And on top of it, I I had this whole process of, working through my dissertation research and then living rural in a foreign country. And I'm just like, there's so much more in common with all these people and all the things we want out of life than the way the partisanship seems to suggest. And then now Trump got elected, and on the one hand, there's like maybe these people who are a little bit like me, the Make America Healthy Again people, but then on the other hand, like Trump's doing like just straight up like idiotic Republican stuff, and I'm just like, who am I anymore? Where do I belong? Then I'm like, so I feel like this will be a good therapy session for me. Partially because I'm just like, where is this coalition going? And then I think on the left, a lot of people are sort of like defecting from that thing that I defected from years ago of like this purity, scoldy, like, just really angry kind of energy. So I think there's a place here to build a coalition. So I want to like just talk about that and who we feel like we are identity wise in the moment, and, how we can bring people in. That's enough for me. And then Rich, some clarifying thoughts from you?
Yeah. I feel like I'm in a similar boat to you, but I'm not in the US. So I like at some level, I don't care about Trump getting elected. It's like, this doesn't have that much impact on me, but I'm originally from New Zealand. Now I live in Europe, and it's really obvious the way that the US still sets the agenda, both for like the culture and the counterculture. Like I spent my first 30-something years in New Zealand, and it's incredible how much of our political discussion is shaped by American political discussions, often in ways that are really distorting people's vision of reality. Because it's like, for example, any question of race in the US is completely different from what's happening in New Zealand.
Okay.
But we sort of import these concepts and then have to try and manipulate them to fit the conversation.
Yes, I've seen this in action. Yeah.
So I'm not going to have any opinions about who is running the government, but more about what I perceive to be a cultural moment and the impact that has on the broader Western progressive scene. It's not even really a movement, but like a network of subcultures, people who have, my interest is like, what are the conversational norms in our organizations and our events in our network? Those are the kind of things that really get me. Like, what is it like being with other progressive people? And the way that is changing. That's kind of my interest. And the moment that I think that we're in, my sort of hypothesis or my provocation is essentially and you can say you mark it at the election as kind of the most obvious moment, but the progressives have lost the moral high ground, like just decisively. I think they already lost it the first time Trump got elected, but it just took a long time for people to get with the program and realize that, guys, this, like you say, this purity, the scolding, this like elitist posture is really putting people off. It doesn't work. And a lot of really well-meaning people put a lot of good energy into like trying to create a particular political movement around a set of norms, and they have just given up. And I think the three of us are in that boat of like, oh, that doesn't actually work going in that direction. We want to do something else. And so the moment that I see we're in, there's a fork in the road, and in like really blunt terms, I would call it anti-woke or post-woke. And the reason I'm nervous about this is like, I would hope that I'm organizing in a post-woke way, meaning like I'm aware of injustice, I'm aware of sexism, I'm aware of how oppression works. And that has informed the choices in how I design my organization, how we do accountability, how we communicate. And it just doesn't look the way that progressive organizations have looked for the last 15 or 20 years. There's certain norms that we like intentionally do not reproduce because we don't think they're effective. And I want people to realize that we're modeling something which I would say is like a step forward into the future, and it might bear some resemblance to a step backwards. So it's like basically we've got the reactionary move or the integrated forward move. And both things are going to happen. And I want to clarify, what is the integrated position where we can just get on with it? You know, it's like, I think people are really fed up and like, we want to have a new kind of a conversation. We want to organize in a different kind of way. Like, can we get on with it? One of the things that I thought could be useful to like anchor the conversation is for the three of us to credentialize a little bit, not in terms of like, this is how much of a cool leftist I am, but more like, what was it in your earlier experiences that called you towards the left in the first place? Like, what were the experiences or the values that actually animate you and say, this is worth fighting for? Because I would assume some of those things haven't changed at all. And it's more about the tactics and the embellishments that, the sort of cultural form that it's taken that has become quite repulsive.
Yeah, totally. I'll let Gabe do some, like maybe narrative where he's at the moment. And then maybe let's go around and do a little of like our leftist credential. You know what? I guess it's more like a statement of values, what it is that we're drawn to morally, like, and those things, I maintain many of those things still have not changed for me, and that everyone else is crazy, and I'm like, I'm maintaining my position. Everyone else has lost their mind. So anyways, Gabe, I'll let you maybe just give a little background of like what you're thinking, where you're at, and then we'll do that.
Sure. Yeah. So in pursuit of a post-woke synthesis, just like Rich was saying, right, we're kind of at a moment where there's some pretty powerful forces. Some are tugging towards revanchism and trying to go, all the way back, or trying to obliterate sort of every bit of change that's happened in the last 15 years, rather than targeting the specific sort of like cultural and political changes that way exceeded the left's mandate to change society, that way exceeded, like making institutions explicitly anti-male was far outside of their mandate, right?
Right.
There was no, right, it's one thing to say women aren't getting enough time to speak. It's one thing to say people of color are not getting their chance to steer their own movements and steer their own organizations. Like, that's true, right? That's still true at this point. But like the black and white thinking that's endemic to American culture just blew this thing out of proportion. I would say, I guess one thing I want to say that's interesting to me too is I'm also less interested in the politics of things, although I don't believe that politics are downstream of culture. I actually think in this day and age, they're co-constructed. I am primarily concerned with culture as somebody, I lived in Portland, Oregon for a long time. Almost all my friends were there. Obviously, I'm from a very far left context. And nowadays, as I'm looking ahead, I'm wanting to start a spiritual center in Colorado. I'm interested in organizing, making an organization, and we're facing a lot of questions about culture, and we're facing a lot of questions about what are these new social norms? What does this look like going forward? And do we try to take revanchism head on? Do we double down? Do we what's the right way to do this? And I know I've been so alienated from what left norms have become, at least culturally, or I would say blue tribe more than left. It's more like urban city norms. I've been so alienated from that just because of how unconsciously hostile it's become toward people who have identities that I hold, that I have to balance this emotional desire to be like, fuck you people, you're not allowed in my org. Am I allowed to say the F word on Doomer Optimism?
Yeah, it's fine.
Okay. Because there's a part of me that wants to be like, yeah, if you were a part of this at any time, you're blacklisted, get the hell out of here. And of course, that's not fair because I was part of it.
Right.
Everybody's got to have the chance that they need to change their mind and to update and all of that. But I don't think they can unless someone articulates what a post-woke synthesis could look like that preserves the core values of the left while excising the cancer.
Yeah. Totally. Okay, so I was just taking some notes, trying to put together some of the things that I, thought, sort of leaning toward leftism in my earlier life, and which I still hold. A lot of it is just kind of old school battle in Seattle. I've said this a bunch of times. Old school battle in Seattle, anti-corporate, anti-globalization stuff. It's just kind of power to the people. We have so much corporate takeover in a way that totally harms basically the vulnerable, children. I remember seeing this video when I was younger called The Story of Stuff, and it was this toxins in our food system making its way into breast milk and then harming the most vulnerable members of our society. That is the kind of thing I'll never not care about and animates me, and so it's that kind of anti-machine stuff. Obviously the environmental angle, toxins, pollution, and not just climate change. That's another thing that I've been on about, biodiversity, soil health, water health, that's 90s environmentalism kind of stuff. And then I don't know, I grew up in Chicago in the 90s, and we had kind of peak multiculturalism then. It was great. I went to school in a really diverse school, grade school. We had a lot of cultural exchange stuff. Everybody in Chicago public schools, including all the white kids, obviously, knew and sang the Black National Anthem, which is a beautiful song. And I was fine with it. It wasn't something I was mad about or anything. It was just this is cool. It's cool that you have this. It's a beautiful song. I understand how it's connected to this whole lineage of slavery, and we want to recognize that and sing this beautiful, uplifting, we're all in this together type song. I love that. I feel that the opposite of what we need is the constant I think part of what I really hate about the left is the constant spreadsheet rationalist, let me talk about diversity quotas as opposed to the underlying cultural thing, which is part of living in a diverse society is you have to understand the non-spreadsheet side of these things, which is kind of you got to make fun of people a little bit. You have to be able to coexist in a way that's plays on the tensions, and it's very nuanced, and it's not if we just have this diversity quota based on this number, everything will be solved. A lot of it is really nuanced culturally. So all of that stuff, I just feel that would be great to have back. And then just there's so much divisiveness about the environmental stuff now. I think probably post-COVID, a lot of COVID stuff broke people's brains. And now everybody, I think about this in a historical materialist sense as a sociologist, as institutions break down, people's trust just kind of breaks down, and then they are grasping for sources of information, and then they kind of hunker down into these little tribes that feel really reactionary and aren't really integrated and aren't really a healthy way to think. So I think there's just a lot to fight culturally with that stuff. Which I understand. I'm empathetic as to why people feel cagey in a like hyper scaled society that is now breaking down a lot of the institutions that people once trusted. And so then they're like, okay, I guess I'm just on my own here. And then they like kind of freak out, and then they find their little tribe, and then it's us against the world mentality. We just got to get past that somehow. Even if it's in a smaller scale, like, modeling how to get past that. Okay, so that's good for now. I guess I'd be curious to hear your two leftist credentials. Rich, you want to go?
I'm just amused, Ashley, at your eagerness to get into the critique part. It's like, I'm going to try and stick with the appreciation. Like, if I can simplify my story, it's like I grew up in a very old-fashioned fundamentalist church. Eventually had this kind of dramatic rupture with the church, and there I think immediately there's the seeds for like anti-authoritarian, sort of libertarian, anarchist. Like, I'm extremely sensitive to oppression and domination, and like how hierarchies are used to reduce people's agency and create these just domination hierarchies, and how, okay, obviously it was at my church where I was being told you have to believe these things, otherwise you're going to face the most infinite punishment. But it's also happening in normal secular schools and just everyday life at work, like that. These domination hierarchies are everywhere. And I got quite randomly, I think, just sort of stumbled into the Occupy movement once it arrived in New Zealand. And there was such a perfect opposite of that, it was like this opposite of the authoritarian, opposite of the hierarchy thing, all about freedom and working together, and we'll figure it out, and we're going to do consensus, and nobody's going to be in charge. And obviously all the shortcomings of those methodologies, but that was just tremendously exciting for me, and not just exciting emotionally, but like it was one of the most significant developmental periods of my life, the couple of months that I was involved with Occupy, because I was in daily deliberative practice with other citizens in the city square, and I had to put my perspective in the context of all the other perspectives and figure out what's true, what's important, what can we all agree on, where are the actual disagreements that need to be worked out. Like you said at the start, actually, it turns out we already agree on most of the important stuff, and there's some sort of like icing on the cake that needs to be negotiated. It's mostly an agreement. So that was like tremendously uplifting for me, and kind of propelled my life into a completely different sphere, where prior to that I was really nihilistic and lost. And then since then I've been much more optimistic and energized and active, and I feel like I'm playing an active citizenship role, like I'm awake and engaged in my world. And since then a lot of my work has just been about enrolling more people in small scale direct democracy, just like what can you do to take responsibility for your life and not defer to some external authorities. So that's really strong in my politics. It's just my everyday assumption now is that people should be free, and that they should take the time to get to know their neighbors and try and find common cause and be good to each other and be generous. I don't know where that positions me, if that makes me a socialist or something, but that's a lot of it. And I think from Occupy, because I was politically naive, I absorbed a lot of what was going on around me, the books that people were reading, when people were criticizing the things that I was saying, I was taking it seriously. And I feel like I got a really good education in some ways. So like, I remember having, my own sort of like consciousness raising about, oh, this is how hierarchy works, this is how domination works. And then subsequently over time, learning how the same dynamic plays out with sexism, for example, and having that, the word woke is about awakening up to it's like the blinders coming off, and you're like, wow, there's all this shit going on that I didn't recognize before. I had that moment with sexism and understanding like frankly, the brutality that it's just like part of everyday life for women that I had been systematically kind of obscured from observing. Like, again, that's super motivating to discover that there's this everyday injustice going on just like systematically across the board. And so I got really motivated to basically, I want to be a good feminist man. And as I'm increasing in public stature, I felt a responsibility that I should use my platform to deconstruct patriarchy or to draw attention or do something good. And basically I found it pretty soon, within a couple of years, I found it just so rife with contradictions as to be impossible, that there was no path that I could take that actually felt fruitful if I could hold integrity with what my actual experience. Like, there's a bunch of propositions inherent in contemporary feminism that just kind of make it impossible to be honest and straightforward about who I am and to be seen as a good ally. It's just literally, I can't do it. And so that really put me in a bit of a bind. But I still care about people being free and being well and people's thriving. And it's just like, well, where is the movement that I'm part of that I'm actually wholeheartedly enrolled in, where I can put my talent and my energy and my resources and privilege into wholeheartedly supporting that? There isn't one. And this is, I think, part of my motivation for this conversation is that, can we please call out who else there cares about the stuff that we care about? And can we please be normal and effective and actually care about making progress instead of just like, here I go into my critique. I'll press pause and pass to Gabe.
We've all got suplex energy. We're just ready to let loose. I won't spend too much time on it. I also grew up in a fundamentalist Christian community, actually a Catholic praise community called City of the Lord. It's the same community that the Supreme Court Justice Amy Coney Barrett is from. I didn't know her. I just say that so if it rings a bell. She's older than me. I didn't know her, but I went from that to it was actually I think it was the values I was raised with as a Catholic that really led me to left ideas, and it was a concern for the poor, and it was a concern for the for people who were downtrodden, and I had a huge break with my family over the Iraq War. Because the Pope had come out against it and my parents were still supporting it. And this was kind of like a big break for me where I realized, like, if I want to follow my own values, it's going to mean going against a lot of stuff. But I was right at the age where I had a lot of energy for that. So it was all right. And paradoxically, strangely, a few years later, I ended up joining the Marine Corps because in part because I just had a baby and I needed the money, and in part because it was 2006, Fallujah just happened, things were not going well, and I was like, I think I can help. So I joined up, and something I saw that was very interesting, maybe the total opposite from Rich, but within this dominance hierarchy, there were incredibly good racial relations, and there were incredibly good, like, we all had a common cause. We all had common metrics that said everybody here is green. And I know that there are Marines who have had experiences, female Marines, and certainly, where they did not experience it in the same way as me. But generally speaking, we all related well to each other. If someone had a real problem with discrimination, we all took it seriously. I remember very clearly Don't Ask, Don't Tell going away, and a sergeant in the office that everyone knew was gay. The only thing that changed is we had something new to make fun of him for, and it was all very jovial. It was all very brotherly. He was relieved, to finally just be able to be open about it, and it was fine. It was like we didn't care, right? Because he was a good shot and a good leader and a good Marine, and who gives a damn,
Yeah.
Now, that's what competent people do. It's, that's anyway. So I came out of the Marine Corps and into the Portland, Oregon art scene almost directly afterwards, sort of as like a, how do I get free of, how do I grow my hair out? How do I grow my beard? How do I relax? How do I relax after all this Catholicism and Marine Corps? And before, like, at the time, social justice stuff was just starting to take hold, but it wasn't pervasive yet. And I sort of watched in the art scene over the next 10 years as like a progressive ideology that was not, that purported to be based in theory, that is quite sound and I think actually quite rigorous, from the Frankfurt School, a sort of blend of Marxism and psychoanalysis that's actually quite astute and really excellent criticism. But what they did is they cherry picked a bunch of the ideas that were the most inflammatory and the most socially manipulative. And they took those ideas and they applied those instead of following them to their logical conclusion, which is universal simultaneous liberation. We all need to let each other go at once, or else the dialectics will pull us back in. And what I watched was the most neurotic, the most manipulative, the most sociopathic people slowly take over my social scenes. My not just in art, but outside of that too. And I got to a point eventually where the primary reason I was running a Burning Man theme camp, we had a little bit of a broader arts organization around it, about 150 people in it, pretty good budget every year. And the reason that I decided to pass it off, the reason I decided I don't want to do this anymore, was because the woke culture had gotten so thick and so bad. That I would have parties at my house and people would come over and they would touch some piece of furniture they liked, which wasn't even particularly expensive, and be like, yeah, well, this is a nice white guy thing to have. This is a nice... So, I mean, it was like the resentment was so thick. It was so just coming off, radiating off of them. And I didn't have any way to be like, you know what, get the fuck out of my house. Well, that's
a white guy thing to say.
Yeah, exactly. Like, how dare you, And so it kind of felt like I was hemmed in on all sides by this culture into constantly, into this kind of subservient, I have to, kind of constantly be self-hating, constantly be whatever. And it's like, I believe in this stuff as much as you guys do. Like, I want this for you as much as you want it. Like, I believe, where's all this friendly fire coming from?
I'm an ally, right?
Exactly. Yeah. What the hell is going on here? And it, so I basically got to a point where I was like, fuck this crap. I'm not doing it anymore. And it actually did not cost me too many friends. It like, surprisingly, like, my most ideological, most woke friends were like, oh, you're a Nazi now. And I was like, yeah, I know. Cause like, that's what we call everybody who doesn't agree with you. But most of my actual friends were like, no, you're right. Like, privately, they were like, yeah, we have these feelings too, but nobody can say it because it's Portland and because it's the art scene and because it's whatever. And shortly after that, like, there was VividVoid started, and I was able to start writing about this stuff on the internet, and really trying to find a way to criticize the excesses of woke culture and blue tribe culture without falling into the well-worn discourse grooves of anti-wokeness or revanchism or resentment of the resentment or whatever. It's like, how do you land a solid critique of feminism without coming off like a sexist? That's a really tricky thing, it turns out, right? Like, it's very tricky to level a critique of Black Lives Matter without coming off like a racist, because these attractor basins are just there, right? And they're effective and they're compelling, they're emotionally compelling. It's very hard to kind of say, well, that's not where I want to go because I don't believe that, right? And so you're trying to like keep this difficult balance, and anyway, here we are, and there's my credentials. I guess that's the best explanation I've got of where we're at.
Yeah. I have a quick story, but then I'll maybe toss it to Rich to like tell us where we could go next. But so when I first got on Twitter, it's 2020. I was trying to like just figure out what was going on with the election from Uruguay, because there was like such bad information in like the mainstream news. And then like, all these protests and all this stuff was happening. And I remember early on, I was like, what is going on in Minneapolis? And my brother-in-law and sister-in-law lived there, right in that neighborhood where all the riots were happening. And my brother-in-law, who's very left-leaning, was posting on Facebook pictures of like neighbors coming out and like in solidarity helping each other and providing resources and like cleaning up and all this stuff. And I was just like, wow, this is like, I mean, obviously there's like a lot of destruction happening, but then there's also this like solidarity element, which is something I will always be in favor of, whether it's like, Christians at a potluck or like Antifa in Minneapolis. Like, it's a cool thing to see neighbors come together. And I remember like liking a bunch of these posts about like what Antifa was doing, in this like solidaristic fashion. Fast forward like a year and a half later, I'm getting like mobbed by what is now called the woke right. And they're like, you're Antifa trying to integrate our movement. And I was just like, no, like, I was trying to explain, like, at the time I was trying to understand, I'm not like really one way or another, like have really strong opinions about all these things. Like, I'm not even that political necessarily. I'm trying to do this middle ground. And it was just exactly the same experience I had with leftists, where it's just like, do you or do you not, believe Antifa is a good organization? Like, do you or do you not? Like, you need to avow or disavow X, Y, or Z thing. And I was just like, these people are just as idiotic as the others who have gone in that same direction. So, like, basically the impulse to be like, resentful, purity test, scold, that is something I want to avoid at all costs. And so that's like, for sure, it's not just the left that does that either. And so yeah, anyways, maybe Rich, you have an idea of where we can go next, but I just thought that was a funny story because my first experience with the right was basically the same thing.
Yeah. I think it just makes me think we're all implicated in this, right? Like we all have reactionary impulses. Like I can feel it anytime I get into this conversation. There's like part of me that's rational and well-meaning and generous and thoughtful, and then there's another part who's just like hurt and pissed off and like kind of wants to vent, and the venting is therapeutic for me, but it doesn't actually contribute when it's in public. It doesn't actually contribute towards integration and wholesomeness,
Yeah.
And it does take I think a certain degree of almost like self-discipline to think about how to communicate in a public space where you're neither conceding ground to these sort of authoritarian ideologies, nor are you giving them more fuel. It's like it's not that easy to do it. Like you said something, Gabe, about how can I criticize feminism without looking like a sexist? And it's like, well, actually, it's pretty doable in private. Like you build up a reputation for what is your character. How do you, obviously, by your behavior, how is it that you think about women? Like people can see that by the way that you interact with women. And then when you say, hey, I've got some real debates, like stern critique with a lot of the theory and the way that it's actually implemented, then they will say like, oh yeah, I can see this person is like of sound mind and good character and is just thinking along with me about it. But when you try and transport that into public, where we're living in this context collapse, where nobody knows who I am, nobody knows my story, nobody knows what I'm like at home, or how I am at like doing my share of the housework, or that sort of stuff, it's all lost. I have basically retreated from the public conversation on a lot of these issues because it just felt like there hasn't been any open ground that's just not immediately going to get weaponized and either used against me or against someone that I don't want to be attacked, So I've backed out of it. And that's what I think is changing. I think there is an opportunity now, as the norms are getting shaken up, that we can start coming out of the woodwork. Hey, what are the conversations that we haven't felt able to have in public? Can we start bringing them out? Because they've been happening for a long time. Like I wrote in 2018, I wrote a blog post called Metamodern Social Justice, which was already trying to articulate what's the next stage. And that's like 7 years ago. And that blog post was already a big step for me. And it came from years of having had conversations in private with people. So I think there's a lot of opportunity there. I don't know where the conversation should go next, actually, apart from I've got an idea, which is, my focus is always on the subtle, concrete interpersonal dynamics that show up in organizations. That's always the thing that I care about. And I can see some things about what would, for example, on topics like leadership, on topics like conflict, that kind of reveal what an organization is actually made of. I hope that I and we have been prototyping some like post-work synthesis position on like how do we do these topics, and I'd like to talk about that. But I wonder if it's premature to go into the synthesis, or if you've still got venting to do.
Gabe, you want to go?
I'm good. I do my venting on Twitter. I've done plenty of it at this point. I'm not sure there's like a need for that here. I want to just do a synthesis of what you both said, because I actually feel pretty excited about where this seems to be going. You know, Rich, before you mentioned that you were writing about metamodern social justice, I was thinking about metamodernity as the successor to postmodernity. And Ashley, what you were pointing out is that like the right was not criticizing the postmodern left from modernity, from a standpoint of modernity and a standpoint of return. They were criticizing it from a postmodern position themselves, one of total relativity, you know, absolute relativity across the board. And really, you know, I mean, postmodernity is characterized by grief over the death of God, right? Like that's the primary affect of postmodernism. So when Rich talks about meta-modernity, right, or when we're talking about like what comes after postmodernity, there's a thinker actually here in Boulder who's been part of my internet scene since before actually my scene even really existed. His name's David Chapman, and he writes a blog called Meaningness. And he articulated some ideas about meta-modernity early on, which was basically this notion that we can switch modes of meaning making as is appropriate for the situation. So a meta-modern person would recognize, hey, rather than woke needs to be a totalizing ideology and we all need to be in rebellion against legacy American culture all the time, because it's fundamentally cis hetero patriarchal sexist, blah, blah, blah. What you do instead is you say, okay, legacy American culture is this organic thing that's grown over time, over hundreds of years. This is the frame most people are unconsciously using, even most of the woke people, whether they're aware of it or not. And so we don't, you know, what we don't do is try to create something totalizing that says this is bad and this is good, or we try to create some new grand narrative. Meta-modernity says there are times in which we can say, well, what if we use the woke framework here? And what if we use the legacy American framework here? And what do we find meaningful if we look at it from this way? What do we find meaningful if we look at it from this way? And then I think right now what we have is this really extraordinarily powerful set of critical tools that we can use to diagnose real problems like sexual harassment in the workplace, or real problems like the fact that the accumulated wealth of the average Black family in Boston is $8. And it's been like this since the 1980s. They haven't been able to accumulate any wealth, you know, and we have tools that can zoom in on this, but we have to stop making it giant social projects that are about the egos of the people in charge. And we have to be like, we need to use the tools for the present moment, right? The situation that's actually at hand. And so I do think actually this moment is a moment to start not just defining what the post-woke synthesis looks like, but actually moving forward like a meta-modern proposition for organizations and institutions.
I love that. I have two things to say real quick, and then it'll maybe help us for the next step. I had somebody who's been a friend to the podcast. He's known as Anarcho-Contrarian on Twitter, but he left Twitter. Sure. He's really big into these like, you know, town meeting models, like direct democracy on a tiny scale. And he and I were both at this event in Margaretville, New York, which I brought together like Paul Kingsnorth and Matt Crawford, all these different really cool people. In that room, there was this real sense that the only morality we can draw on is that of the church. And me and Anarcho-Contrarian, like I think that there is a really important role that the church can play, but me and Anarcho-Contrarian were both like, there is a civic morality also. This exists. It's like even in like 1850 in New Hampshire, it would be like you bring a certain set of moral principles to your church community and you bring a different set of moral principles to the town meeting, where you're meeting with people from all different religions, but you have the town's, well-being in mind. And so I love this idea of like, and I think we've solved this. Like, this is something we know how to do. You bring different moral frameworks to different situations. I'm a different person in my like environmental work as I am when I'm talking about like school stuff in my neighborhood with other moms, as I am in church, as I am like, you know, with the Doomer Optimism crew when I'm in a, like, you know, meeting up with them. So that's one thing. I think that's a really perfect thing to be thinking about as we go forward. Like we don't need to have these totalizing frameworks that where like the friction is you go to Thanksgiving and you're bringing in this like extreme woke framework to your family. Like, dude, leave it at the door. You've got a different framework with your family. You have to be mature enough to realize you can be different people in different situations. The other thing I wanted to talk about, and this goes to Rich's point, maybe we can talk a little bit about experiences we've had that are actually kind of like nuanced qualitative descriptions of the interpersonal dynamics needed for this kind of post-woke thing, or, you know, I guess, yeah, post-woke, not anti-woke. In these events that I held 2 in Wyoming and 1 in New York, and I kind of just stumbled into this. People wanted an event. I put one together. I was super scared before the first one. Like, how is this going to go? All these different weirdos. They mostly disagree about a lot of things, but nobody is an ideologue. And we're setting the tone of the meeting so that it feels fun and convivial. And the way that works is basically like people get their time to speak. They give their different speeches during the day, like a conference. You know, we have panels and this kind of thing. The things people talk about were all over the map, from like environmentalism to like women's issues to whatever, family life and homesteading and all this kind of stuff. And then in the evenings, the first evening, we had an open mic night where people are just singing together, getting up, singing along, making requests. The second night, people are started to like loosen up. We did a what we called mini debates, and the really fun format of this was you stand up in front of the group and you say like, I'm going to argue for X thing. So like a funny example is Andy Hickman went up to argue for drunk driving as kind of a joke. And the thing is that the debates were very tongue-in-cheek, like, and then somebody came up against drunk driving. This is Nate Gates, and Nate was just like, "This is so stupid." It was like, "This is so it's drunk driving's bad," you know. But the whole modeling of just like fun ribbing of one another, not taking our ideologies so seriously, arguing for something, but then kind of like making fun of yourself during it. There was another one where Andy argued against the internal combustion engine. And then the counterpoint, Paul McNeil, was like, "You hitchhike, dude. Like, how does that make sense? You know, whatever." So it was just like a really like spirited atmosphere where there's this sense of like, you know, we can't take ourselves so seriously or put our ideologies so much to the forefront that we can't like relate to each other as humans. And a lot of really fun relationships and friendships have formed from these events that I think probably don't necessarily happen in a sense where like, let's only invite in-group people who like totally get it and are totally on board with 100% of everything we think. And we're like purity testing who can come. But instead it's like, let's invite the masses, the weirdos, and see what happens, as long as you model this kind of like base level respect of one another. And there's like this also American tradition of like, you know, we're like, we have a freedom to assemble. Like we can get together in small little groups and work things out and figure things out together. And so I feel like there's something there that can be modeled and used. So I'd be curious, like Rich too, and then maybe Gabe, to talk about experiences you've had like that, but that we can be thinking about.
Yeah. I think it's good to get into the specifics. And I assume that in looking at a few stories, we'll probably see there's a shifting in priorities of what are the values that are governing how we interact with each other. So the recent years, it seems like the most important values are like safety, as defined by emotional regulation, like people not getting triggered, and consent. Like this thing of, if something is happening to me, I absolutely must consent to it before it happens to me. And those are sort of like some of the foundational principles of what progressive interactions look like. And what you just described was actually, we're going to put conviviality ahead of that. There's going to be some ribbing. You didn't consent to being ribbed, but it's called being an adult and having fun,
Yeah.
And so I think, we're going to see this like reprioritizing your values. And it doesn't mean we're abandoning consent. It doesn't mean we're abandoning safety, but we're actually just like reprioritizing. The couple of examples that I had come to mind for me, one was about leadership. So, I talked about domination hierarchies in my introduction. There's a difference between a hierarchy and a domination hierarchy. There's a competence hierarchy. There's a developmental hierarchy. Like, I'm learning Spanish at the moment, and I'm learning from someone who knows Spanish better than me. Like, that's essential to the whole operation. Speaking of operations, like when I need a surgery, I want to find the best possible surgeon. I don't want to get all of the hospital staff together and by consensus decide where they're going to slice me up. Like, there's obvious cases where it's useful to be able to identify people with special traits and say, hey, you've got a unique role here. This has been a hard lesson for me to learn, of having been really steeped for a long time in a anti-authoritarian, non-hierarchical way of organizing. And so I've been looking for like, what's a model of leadership that fits people like myself that have all of these allergies around how hierarchy can go wrong. And something that's worked for me and for my peers is framing hospitality as the model of leadership that we're aiming for. Because to me, it feels very natural that, like, if I'm visiting your house, Ashley, we have expectations of each other as host and guest. Like, I'm going to defer to you in many respects, and you're going to take care of me. It's like there's this reciprocal encounter where we've got protocols that govern how we interact. And when it goes well, we're both delighted. There's no threat in the room. There's no, it's not like, oh God, Ashley's now dominating me because she's the one that decided what the menu is for dinner. It's like, oh, wonderful, she's cooked this thing. I haven't had this before.
Yeah.
But taking that attitude towards how we lead organizations, that like organizations do need leaders. They don't necessarily need one leader, but like at least a small group of people that are taking on a hosting posture and setting the norms and saying who's in and who's out. And, you described this awesome event that you had, Ashley. Part of the reason it works is because everyone that came looks up to you as a person individually. They know something about your reputation. And when things get weird, they unconsciously look towards you and they say, is Ashley freaking out? No, she seems fine. Okay, it's probably fine. Like, that's what's stabilizing that group and why it's working so well. That's a big part of it. And because they're all...
Me attending your event, it was people looking to you, yeah.
Yeah. And like people at my event where you were there, people are trying to bring their particular ideologies and they're trying to do the fundamentalist move and they're trying to take over. And I just don't let them. Like, I hold the power in that situation and I'm trying to use it for the greater good.
The hospitality of the group over someone trying to hijack it.
Yeah. So that's the first principle is leadership is hospitality. And it just seems that framing kind of opens it up for people with values like me. And that, my role as a leader is really to be generous and to be accommodating and to be caring and to, elevate your status. But still, my house, my rules at some point, as a backstop. Not that I'm going to dictate what exactly is all the conversations that are happening in my house, but I'm going to say what behaviors are excluded here. And then the second one is about sort of conflict or what happens when people get upset with each other. And I think this is really, we had a summer camp, micro-solidarity summer camp in August this year. And you really see the fracture start to open up in the group over competing sets of norms around what should we do when someone gets upset. And I think this is actually a really big opportunity to articulate a different set of norms around people's upset, which is like the old progressive way, the last 20 years has been someone is triggered, someone's emotionally distressed, someone is like, they've gone into the state of contraction. They then look outwards saying, well, something has harmed me. There's some bad out there. I need to analyze this from a sort of systemic lens and see what is going wrong in the system that has caused me to feel this way? And now I'm going to start recruiting my allies, and we're going to assemble a case, and we're going to get the whole group's attention on this thing that happened and make sure it doesn't happen in future. And that's just like a normal way of dealing. Like, I'm upset because the men here are taking up too much space. That's like such a normal thing to say in a progressive group. The alternative path is to say, I'm having an emotional experience, right? Like, I'm upset because I was speaking and then this fucking dude came in and he just filled up the space. Okay. The move is to go inwards, like to assume that emotional signals are telling you something about your inner state. Okay, what's happening? I'm mad. I'm feeling powerless. I'm defensive. Okay, there's information in here about what do I need? Well, I need to be respected. I need to be given the time of day. Like, I need this guy to pay attention and share the microphone. Okay, good. Something that you need. Maybe you can clarify that with a friend. And then you can strategize together about, like, what's the action that we can take at the lowest level to resolve that need? Yeah. Is it just that you needed to have a pep talk and then you can say to this guy, hey, shut the fuck up, I'm speaking? Because 9 times out of 10, that is the best response for everyone and it gets the job done.
Yeah.
Rather than immediately jumping to the systemic analysis and saying, oh, it's because of men. It's like, it's not because of men. It's because of one dude and your unwillingness to confront him. Like, why is that? Yeah. It's not my purpose.
No, I know. It's like, I do think I just called this mass sociology brain on Twitter. Everybody wants to make it a statistical thing about X group or whatever. It's like, no, dude, it's just this one dude cut you off. And maybe it wasn't even like because he's a man and you're a woman. Maybe he's just being an asshole, or maybe he's just like oblivious for that one moment or whatever.
Yeah. And so this is where the metamodern thing of switching perspectives, it's like, yeah, you do want to be able to inhabit this class perspective and see what, like, yes, this person does have a few categories that are relevant to the way they're showing up here, but don't jump ahead to the categories. Start with specific, and take some responsibility, and don't expect that there's some systemic solution to you spending 5 minutes getting annoyed about the way the conversation went. Like, that's just such an overuse of power. This is the progressive thing, right? It's like, I want to throw nukes at someone because they annoyed me slightly. Like, just can we keep the escalation to a minimum?
I have the tiniest little story, and then I want to hear from Gabe on his examples. But just today, I'm driving my daughter to school, and I had told her the other day that there are things called pickup lines, and it's like a guy wants to, get your attention. He like says something to kind of get your attention, make you laugh. And I said, one of them is like, you go up to a woman, you say, did it hurt when you fell from heaven? Anyway, she was laughing at it, and she's 11, so we're like, just starting to get into the adolescent conversations. And she told me she told her friend this story, and her friend said, what, you might offend someone with that story because maybe they don't believe in God and heaven. And I'm like, the offended industrial complex. And I'm just like, go on this rant, in the 5 minutes before she gets out of the car. I'm like, you do not have to capitulate to all these people being offended constantly by stuff. It's a way to hijack the conversation, to not have fun, to be a scold, blah, blah. Anyways, I was just telling her all this stuff. Like, you can be friends with these people, but you can be like, no, that's stupid. And just tell them that's stupid. They need to be told this, or like, no, it's just, she literally said to her friend, it's a joke. It's a joke. Oh my God. Anyways, so it's going on to the next generation, but I'm doing my part. Gabe, I'd like to hear from you. I also want to just briefly note that we're talked about all these different examples of where we've seen good things. I'm noting back in the earlier part of the conversation, the Marines, Occupy Wall Street, and like 90s Chicago public schools are all positive examples we've all experienced of good environments where people know how to do this. So there's a lot of good examples out there, but yeah. Gabe, I'll toss it to you.
There's a term that contemporary psychology now considers outdated, but is still used in psychoanalysis, which has roots in a sexist conception of psychology, but is still very useful if you can suspend that, and it's called hysteria. Hysteria is characterized by impressionistic thinking and emotional dysregulation. So impressionistic thinking versus algorithmic thinking, which is to say, like, somebody's done something I don't like, he's male, men. Right. It's a big impression. It's a big, huge, if you try to tease the logic of it apart, it's probably not going to cash out. And then that's fine, because Logos doesn't have a monopoly on the truth, right? Like, some of these impressions and instincts are actually really important and to our psychology and to our way of knowing the world. Hysteria isn't bad. It's just a defense mechanism, right? So, but it's characterized by sort of being ruled by the inner child. And what happened with I think, there's a thinker, I don't know his first name, his last name is Greer, and he wrote a wonderful article about how the moral hierarchy changed in America over time from being an honor-based system of morality to a dignity-based system of morality. And then now we're in a victimhood-based sense of morality. And that there was actually a very good reason for us to go from dignity to victimhood, because it turns out that if you've been victimized by systemic oppression, you know more about the experience of that and how to fix it than somebody who's just really good at keeping it together with repression, right? So we accurately diagnosed, okay, actually the people who have suffered through this really actually need to be elevated. We need to hear their voices. It's very important. But what we didn't count on was the hysteria. We didn't count on the huge backlog of trauma and pain that has made them unable to be effective in institutional settings and be effective in social settings and actually be efficacious about pursuing their own needs for change in social justice, right? Like, Rich, what you were talking about is an actual application of psychology plus left concepts, which is what the Frankfurt School was advocating 50 years ago and what woke is supposedly built on. But instead, what it became is all this insane, offense archaeology, and everybody's looking for a bias and everybody's looking for a prejudice and everybody's looking, and it's like, well, yeah, you have all of those things. Of course you do. Right. But being totally emotionally dysregulated about it doesn't accomplish anything except to terrorize everyone. And we've seen this over and over and over again in the left's inability to be effective without devolving into a circular firing squad, because we keep deferring to histrionics, right? And I get histrionic is kind of the new word for hysterical, but it doesn't mean the same thing, and it's not. We kind of need this old concept of like being ruled by your inner child, because instead of us saying there is wisdom in suffering and victimhood that we have not incorporated into our moral hierarchies, what we did instead is we fetishized weakness and we fetishized victimhood. And this led to insane things like physical exercise is right-wing coded. What the fuck?
Or farmers markets or whatever. Yeah.
Like, eating healthy is for Republicans. Like, you're gonna lose because you're unhealthy, right? Like, so something I'm doing, and I in organizing this center going forward, it is going to be a Dharma-based center. So I'm sort of blending Western psychotherapeutic concepts about the self concept, along with sort of like Tibetan Buddhism, Zen Buddhism concepts about the self, but the primary goal of the spiritual center is not enlightenment. And that's like a major thing. Like, we're not in the business of trying to liberate people or help them transcend the world or whatever. We're in the business of making people strong and psychologically strong. So where's your backbone? Where's your assertiveness? Where's your self-regulation? Where's your self-mastery? Where's your ability to keep your emotions in check so that you can be effective in the moment at achieving your goals? Because a person who has these strengths, who has a really palpable sense of who they are and how they can be effective and how to be strong in the world, that actually gives you this really powerful, shimmering outline of yourself in subjectivity, like in your experience. And from there, it's very easy to pick it apart if you want to go the Buddhist way and get enlightened. But most people actually really struggle with this because they're not strong enough. And the problems in contemporary Dharma are the same problems in contemporary progressivism, which is this weak self-concept. It's this weak, fluid self-concept. And subjectivity, if I'm being too technical, like I can pull it back here, but like postmodern subjectivity is fluid fundamentally, but it still presupposes that we're one person, right? Whereas a metamodern subjectivity is like, we contain multitudes. All of us contain multitudes. We are different people in different circumstances. And integrity means pulling these things together. It means pulling these parts together and saying, like, how do we get them all? Not how do I split off and deny and repress everything that isn't the one that I want to be, but how do I bring them all together and describe that accurately?
Yeah. I have a question for both of you. I know you're running this class right now, which Rich affectionately describes as how to be an asshole.
Yeah.
But I feel like it's kind of like how to be an asshole for like victimized leftists or something, you know, like people who like have learned to be an asshole by weaponizing their victimization. And then that kind of leads to this cycle where they're not actually feeling empowered, but instead this new way of being empowered that comes from like strength and an inner capacity or something. I wonder if you might talk a little bit about what you're learning in that class and how it applies to this topic.
It's much less for cry bullies, and it's much more for people who have been stomped into the ground by cry bullies.
Okay.
Over and over for the last 10 or 15 years.
Okay.
Rich, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, when I described it as training and how to be an asshole, that was a private conversation, actually. It's not how we represent ourselves in the marketplace.
I can cut this out if you would want me to.
offended.
No, we're teasing. No.
My offense button got touched. It's essentially assertiveness training that is coming from a perspective of actually understanding how the nervous system works and taking people who are, you know, go into that moment where there's a conflict between what you want and I want, which happens all day, every day. It happens even in who's taking turn in the conversation. You know, it's like a constant thing. There's this negotiation about whose preferences are going to get met right now. That when that confrontation happens, there's a lot of people, and it seems like a growing portion of the population, that will either head towards the flight mode, which is like, I'm just going to get the hell out of here, or the fawn mode, which is like, I'm going to concede as quickly as I can, give it to you, let you have your thing, and I'll just accumulate some resentment in the process. And we're saying, we want you to move fight-wise. Like, we want you to understand that you have a different activation pathway in your nervous system, which is when you're, wow, something is important to me and it's at threat, and I'm going to protect it. And I'm going to move towards that confrontation. I'm going to be the one that advocates for myself because I can't expect anyone else to do it. I'm going to learn how to communicate firmly without going into excessive aggression and ask for what I want. And if they won't give me what I want, negotiate within my boundaries and look for a satisfying outcome. And the reason that's hard is because it's happening in this sub-rational parts of us, these like impulsive parts of us, the more animal or the more childish parts of us, that once you start to get activated, once you get into a confrontation with someone, like I described it, you know, we're at the progressive meeting and this guy's cutting you off, as your nervous system starts to activate, you lose access to some of your cognitive capacity, and you do kind of regress somewhat to a more childlike state. And so what we're doing in our course in FightWise is giving people repeated practice where you're going to go into simulated conflicts and get familiar with the sensation of like, oh yeah, this is what anger feels like. It's not the end of the world. It's uncomfortable. I'm still working within my zone of tolerance. So we're like extending people's zone of tolerance and giving them like familiarity with that space so they can act skillfully when it happens in the real world. And this, I think, is symptomatic, like, as a small contribution to what's happening in the world, but I think it is symptomatic of something that's changing in culture, where the whole point of this workshop is we are going to trigger you and you're going to learn how to be skillful with it. Whereas all the previous workshops I ran for the last 5 years is like, we're going to avoid triggering you at all costs because, wow, how bad that would be.
Yes. I actually think this concept of like what you guys are doing in this class is essential to this particular conversation, because I think it's really in that moment where you are confronted with somebody saying, you're victimizing me, and therefore the conversation shuts down and you either are like, you know, screw this person, screw this whole organization, I want nothing to do with these people. Or like you said, you're just like, okay, yeah, I'm so sorry. You know, what can I do to make it right? And similar, like, to what you were saying, Gabe, like with the couch comment, it's like, what are you supposed to do in that situation? It's like, that exact moment is exactly what people have to work through and be like proud of. I think, like, I don't know, have enough self-assurance to push back on, without then going in the opposite direction of like, like, screw this, screw all these people, like, I'm done with all of them, but instead modeling it. I've had some experience with this throughout my years. Like, for example, I was in this, I think one of the earliest experiences I had of the pronoun thing. I was in, I think it was like, I forget the year, but I think like 2016 or something. I was in a meeting where the facilitator asked everybody to go around and say their pronouns. And I was sitting next to this like 60-year-old guy from England. And he was like, what does that mean? And I was like, just say he, him. And then I like explained to him afterwards. But then I took the facilitator aside and I was like, if you're going to have people say their pronouns, you're going to have to explain what that is and why it's important, and explain that to the group. If you want that to be like the rule of this room, you need to justify it. It's a novelty. It's not something people understand. And you're alienating people by assuming everybody understands your sort of novel experience of the world that you think is like doing something better. That conversation didn't go over well. But at least I said it.
He deserves to be alienated because he's a white man from an older generation.
And it's just like, because you aren't in these like niche social circles, you're a bad person. When he's like,
my responsibility to educate you.
It's like, there's an integration here, right?
Sorry,
like,
Ashley. Sorry.
No, it's okay.
I felt really proud of myself for clocking this one recently, because I've had the same situation. I'm not going to ask everyone at a group, at an event, to name their pronouns, because I know it makes some people feel more included and it alienates other people. And I'm like, I'm not going to choose which group gets the priority in this situation. But instead, I can start an event by saying, okay, we're going to do a round, and you can tell everyone what your name is. And if there's anything else that you want the group to know about you, now's a good time to say it. And so that's a way where people, if that's important to them, that people know their pronouns, they can say it. If people are just like, oh yeah, I'm hard of hearing, please speak up when you're talking to me. Great. We don't have to like enforce, but we can still respect like what is the legitimate concern, where that's coming from. And I think the examples that you're giving, Ashley, to me, it's mostly actually about leadership. It's like when someone brings that posture of that victimhood, the power from beneath, this like, I'm going to try and hijack the situation by claiming I've been hurt. Everyone's going to look to the leader to see how you respond. And the move that works, as far as I know, there's probably more detail that I haven't got yet. But the thing is, like, as concisely as possible, acknowledge whatever legitimate concern they're actually bringing, because there's usually some kernel there that's true, and that's how they get people on their side, is because there's a legitimate concern. Acknowledge that, and then reassert your position in the hierarchy and say, I'm in charge of this space. These are the rules of the game. If you're willing to play by those rules, please continue. If you're not, then we're going to have a conversation outside, because maybe we're going to change how leadership works here, but I'm not going to let you take over the group. And if you can it's possible to do that with literally 25 seconds of an interaction with someone, and it sends a signal to the entire group, oh, this game doesn't work here anymore.
And I think there's something to be said about, like, I guess this is counterintuitive and maybe it's going to sound reactionary or whatever, but like, as somebody who, sometimes I don't want to be the one who has to be the leader and has to put my foot down. And it's really nice. And I don't know if this is like, I think there's a feminine masculine aspect to this, not that women can't be leaders. And I have, done this in certain spaces, but it's nice to just, it's not even necessarily a man has to do it, but it's a masculine type energy to be like, I'm in charge here and I'm the leader. And my goal here is hospitality. And so you're going to look to me and this is what's going to happen here. And so, like, I don't know, when I say like how to be an asshole, I'm like, in a way that's an empowering attitude to go in with. Like, I have like a moral goal here, which is to make this run well and to make everybody feel like they belong. And that's like a very leftist thing, like, I want belonging. I want diversity. I want tolerance. I want pluralism. So I don't know, there's something really nice about like training and thinking, anyone listening to this, thinking of yourself as a leader in in the sense of I'm going to like sort of mandate hospitality here, whether or not it alienates some people, because I think overall, I think that hospitality goal in a lot of these spaces is really an important North Star.
You know, the truth doesn't have to have, and in fact can't have, any enduring identity characteristics. Someone who can quietly reassert. There's no need to undermine masculine, feminine authority. There's no need to undermine any of these identities. Somebody who quietly asserts, hospitality, or I think back in the ancient world, they just called it xenos. Like, we're not making anything new here, right? It's like, hey, this is what we go for here. This is what we do here, and this is out of step with what makes this place work. And that's enough for everybody to go, yeah, you know what, you're right. It took me a long time to like remember that, being wrapped up in the stories, the narratives, the ideology of like, oh yeah, the whole thing's, the layered narratives of progressive ideology that here's the way all these oppressions intersect, and here's the way all these blah 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 blah, and in fact you can quietly assert what's best for everyone, and almost everyone goes, yeah, that's true.
I know. Yeah. I have one funny example of this. In Wyoming, we're at this place called the Wagon Box that was at our event, and the theme of the Wagon Box is cozy, wholesome, and based. And at the open mic, I found a funny Twitter thread that I thought somebody should read aloud as like a spoken word poetry. And I was like, this is so hilarious, because it's like a making fun of the raw milk people thread, which I thought was like perfect for the occasion. But it had the F word in it, which is not wholesome. And Paul McNeil, who runs the place, once the F word was said, he was like, no, cut the mic. And I was like, what? This is so funny. And he was like, that's not wholesome. That doesn't belong at the Wagon Box. And I was just like, you know what? You're right. And that was like me being policed. But I think it's so important that we kind of like reassert, like, I have a point of view. I have things that I like more than other things. And if it's my place, I'm going to assert that kind of thing. Yeah. And it's kind of up to me to assert it. Like, this is what mothers do. It's like, come on, don't say that word. Don't speak that way. Don't hit your sister, like these kinds of things. And so it's okay to like have things you like and model that and like police the boundaries of that. People welcome it. Like, the free for all attitude has been really disorienting in a lot of ways.
I wanted to add a balancing voice on, like, we've had a bunch of examples of kind of policing that's happening with an audience. And I think actually much more of this energy happens in private. Like, this is another hospitality consideration for me. It's like, one of the reasons that we've got to this point is really legitimate concerns around safety and around, frankly, wanting to protect women from creepy men. Like, that is like a real significant thing about any time you have a gathering, there's some creepy men, and what are you going to do about it? And then we go way too uptight and make these like completely sterile and unfun environments. We don't have to go in that direction. There's a way to manage the creepy men thing, which is much more subtle and quiet. And I think it's a combination of like what you'd think of as a feminine mode and a masculine mode. Like, the feminine mode is the gossip, which says, hey, there's this dude and we've all had a few interactions with him and it's really uneasy. And then that message gets passed to the bros, and then the bros handle it in private. And they are like, oh, we're going to make sure that this guy always has an eye on him. And if it's like a minor case, we're going to have a conversation with him and just give him some feedback about, hey, when you sit there and just like stare without blinking, that's creepy, dude. You just literally shouldn't do that. And maybe it's the first time he's ever got feedback about like the way that he's showing up. And all he needed was some like older brother figure to just give him a slight bit of private corrective feedback, instead of having, did you know men are dangerous and bad, and everyone look at this bad man, like, which is going to just accelerate his path into being less, more and more antisocial.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah.
Okay, so we have about 10 minutes left. I'm wondering if we can, we had so many good examples here, so much good critique, so much good doom, and a lot of good optimism. So I guess maybe we could go around and think about final statements, things we haven't yet touched on that you were thinking about before this conversation that we want to make sure we get on the record and say out loud? Like, you guys are more steeped in this leftist culture, and I think like people say like this was rejected at the ballot box, quote unquote. Like anytime there's like something annoying that's like super left, is like this was rejected at the ballot box. Like there is a shift happening.
Mm-hmm.
And people are looking for some sort of like new tribe, I guess, cultural tribe, cultural norms, and people to stand up and say, like, this has gone too far. It's really unpleasant. Let's reset. What does that reset culture look like? We talked a lot about like the integration, metamodern, hospitality, that kind of thing. But what else? What else do we need to say before we wrap this up, where we're thinking about where to go and how to like practically enact it? And my thing is always like, you can model things in your own life, you can model things at events, you can model things, speak publicly and model these different kind of cultural things, which is basically what I do. But I don't know if you guys have, I know you have your class, Gabe, you've got your center, Rich, you've got micro solidarity, so you are working on these things. But anything else we want to touch on before we close?
I want to say this one thought that's been at the back of this conversation for a long time is, if we are going to play a role in shaping the next stage in culture, I think we have to be really aware of how hard it is to design a good slogan. So like, so many of the artifacts of what we're fighting against now, what we're frustrated with, is because of the slogans that became popular. So like Gabe was talking about the hysteria that came from amplify marginalized voices. And like the theory, when you actually go and read the book of like, where did that come from? It's a very good theory. Yeah. It's just complex. All of the stuff around intersectionality, all the stuff around identity, it's complex. And once it becomes mainstream, that multi-dimensional complex beast gets flattened down into like a two-dimensional product. That's a slogan. And it's those slogans that rule our everyday cultural spaces. And that's why we got things like the Oppression Olympics, where it's like, actually, if you read standpoint epistemology, really good thinking, really solid. But when it turns into like, we should find the person who has these particular demographic markers and put them in charge, really stupid. If we're going to play a role as some kind of cultural avant-garde, we have to have the complexity as well as the simplicity, and we have to pay attention to the way our multi-dimensional objects flatten down into these two-dimensional shadows. And it's not obvious how to do that. And I think we have to sort of make prototypes and experiments. And that for me is the micro-solidarity thing, is like, let's prototype at the small scale, models of leadership, models of conflict, models of accountability, and see what really works and what feels like a significant fork in the road, like I described about this conflict model. It's a different, it's sort of unassuming on the face, but it's sitting on a really different epistemology underneath it. And we should be generating our slogans from there and spreading them horizontally. And so we've got to pay attention to that. And it's just like a difficult sort of communication / engineering sociology job that I don't know how many other allies I have out there that care about doing that. And I'm going to offer two for my vision of the future. One is 50 aunties and uncles for every kid. I think that's like my main political platform. Every kid should have 50 aunties and uncles, not by blood, but just by neighborhood and by bonds of kinship and care. And in a similar vein, it's universal basic choir membership. I've just joined a choir here recently. I'm new in town. Everyone is incredibly welcoming and lovely, and it's so sweet. And they started mocking me within 24 hours, and it's great. And on Sunday, I'm going to the town fair, and I am performing in front of everyone, and it's going to be terrible.
That's so fun.
People just need to be in civic clubs that are organized around a topic that's fun and good for you, and you just build bonds, that you just realize like, wow, all of these lovely people are all around me all the time. Instead of living in the abstract land, fighting about I don't know what, but having arguments on Twitter. So those are my proposals for 2 new slogans to guide us into the future. What about you, Gabe?
I love it.
I think that the origin of this movement was an attempt to really marry the science of the study of humanity, anthropology, sociology, psychology, with Marxism as it stood. And And my feelings about Marxism aside, just that lovely idea, we can't make it work. Sorry. It was the psychologists were the first to stand up and say something's wrong here. Right? It was John Haidt. It was therapists privately having conversations with each other saying the safe spaces is not good. Trigger warnings are not good. This is not good for people. Creating a culture where everyone is obsequious and walking on eggshells around one another and we rely on a crowd for emotional regulation is terrible for people's psychological health. It's terrible for people's mental health. And I think that one of the ways that's going to need to go forward too is that psychologists are going to have to maybe not be doing cultural critique, but need to be really focusing in on and reiterating this is what it means to be strong and why strength is good, why it's good to have a strength of character, why it's good to come back from victimhood, why trauma makes you stronger when it's healed, and why strength is the endpoint of this, not weakness. I really need to counter this meme that weakness is the way forward, or weakness is a path to success, or social acceptance, or whatever the case is, because it's lodging people in a cesspool, self-loathing and really poor mental health. I see it constantly in people, and they're sort of held back from growing or healing by social pressure, social privileges that are otherwise conferred on them for victimhood and this sort of thing. So I think that I think probably tackling the fetishization of weakness head on and saying, sorry, it's like this for you, and also you need to lead from a position of strength. You need to act from a position of strength. If you can't, we need to get you there before we put you in any kind of position of responsibility over other people. We need to reprioritize this, or else we're going to keep running into the same problems that we have over and over again.
I love that. So I have a couple of just keywords here, stuff that I've been on about for a long time, but just synthesizing what you both just said. Part of it is just scaling down to human scale relationships and not necessarily looking at all this stuff from a societal level and then making aggregate choices that you then weirdly bring to your individual relationships. We've been talking about this. It's just such a weird sociology brain thing, but instead, I think in private communications, a lot of times you can sort of embody a loving strength, and choir membership, something beautiful, something fun, something convivial. You can just model these things on a human scale. And I think starting at that scale, everybody's so focused on hyper scaling everything at all the time, but piloting, proving the model, and then replicating it is the way to go, and doing things on a scale that is more reasonable. And then, I just love that, something I've been on about a bunch, the civic orientation, as opposed to necessarily a political orientation. I think it's great. That's what we need more of. And then it just, people get so mad at you if you tell them they have agency and are capable, if they've been stuck in the victimhood model for a long time. And I've been saying this forever. It's this is actually just spiraling you into, less and less agency and less good things in your life. But instead, if you take this moment and instead, of course you can vent, but instead think about, where do I have agency here? Where are my movements? Where do I have strength? It's you can get caught in a virtuous cycle where you're prove to yourself that you have agency and strength, and then that gives you more feeling of power, and then you sort of build on that, and you keep trying things, and you keep getting better. Obviously this is easier said than done, but it's a muscle to flex, it's a practice to work on.
And you get more relaxed and more respect, and you become kinder the more and more that this happens. It's just beneficial individually, it's beneficial communally, it's just like the best thing we could be asking people on the left who are communally minded to do is to be the rising tide that lifts all the boats around them. Like be the, sorry to interrupt you.
No, that's great. And I think this is what you both are doing in your work and what I'm trying to model too with the stuff that I'm doing. So I'm so glad we had this conversation. I feel like it's really essential right now. I do think we're at a fork in the road. I hope we can, even you don't have, I love Visa's line is like 1% of people is a lot of people. Yeah. I like that idea. You don't have to change the whole of leftism. Not everybody's going to sign on, and maybe they can just go into their, victimhood spirals and whatever happens to them, you can only make people do so much. But there are a lot of people who are like untethered and looking and seeking. And so it's really cool that you guys are working on this. And I'm glad you asked to have a conversation.
Thanks for having us.
All right. Yep.
Thank you.
Bye.
Okay.